See 1 o'clock, and so we will begin. The committee is back in session.
Okay.
I'm going to introduce you, and then you will have the floor for as long as you want. After you finish your presentation, we will have some questions by members. I'm going to have to step out. I'm the chairman. Representative Gus Blackwell and Representative Fisher will conduct the questioning and introduce the next guest. So with that, yes. Do you have an agenda? It was on the meeting notice. I will go run a couple off and bring them back in here in a second. And I'm not exactly sure I get your name right, but we'll take a stab at it. Dr. Zev Werman was a U.S. Department of Education official under George W. Bush, is currently an executive with Monolithic IC3D Incorporated. In 2010, Dr. Werman served on the California Academic Content Standards Commission that evaluated the suitability of Common Core standards for California, and is co-author with Sandra Stotsky of Common Core Standards Still Don't Make the Grade, Pioneer Institute 2010. With that, Dr. Werman, you are recognized.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, thank you for having me here and allowing you to testify in front of you. I'm pleased to speak to you without having to travel long distance. I have been traveling a lot in recent months, so this is a luxury that I'm grateful for. My testimony today, I will focus on the following points. The mediocrity of the Common Core standards, the low level of the Common Core's definition of college readiness, and that the argued benefits of national standards are weak and uncertain, while the major increase in cost of assessment, the loss of state autonomy, the loss of public review, and the loss of educational innovation are real and immediate. Let me address the first point, the quality of the Common Core mathematics standards. The Oklahoma math standards have been rated highly by the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation, Fordham Institute, and they are essentially indistinguishable from the Common Core rating. Well, that should tell you something, because if your standards are essentially as good as the Common Core has been rated, yet your achievement had been mediocre. Does it say that the importance of standard is so high that everything has to change to adopt newer and higher or supposedly higher standard? The answer is clearly no. Standards are just one component in educational achievement, and it's important to have good standards. But it's also important to have aligned systems, to have the buy-in of everyone around, and to have it tuned to your own students, teachers, and educational establishment. The Common Core claims that it's very focused, very coherent, and it is narrowly focused on very few topics in each grade so they can teach them in depth. Yet, if one looks at other countries that are very high achieving, like Singapore or Korea, they are very highly achieving, as I said, yet their curricula are not that narrow and that focused. Yes, they are much more focused than some notional, very wide and mile wide and inch deep curriculum that sometimes is mentioned here in the United States. Yet this idea that our curricula and our standards are mile wide and inch deep stems from the 1990s, where many of our state standards either didn't exist or indeed were very fuzzy. Yet more than 20 years have passed since then, and many states, including yours, have refined their standards. Our standards today are not mile wide and inch deep. They are comparable to the best of them. Let me give you some example of the things that the Common Core standard jettisoned in the rush to be seen as lean and mean. An example I like to use is the issue of money. Everybody understands that starting early with the concept of money for children is very helpful because children have innate curiosity about money. They also have some understanding that they gained at home about coins and bills, and one should build on it. And that's why your own standards and Singapore and other high-achieving countries start very early with the concept of money and coins. Yet Common Core deferred it to the second grade only, much too late. And therefore, they start teaching on numbers without using this wonderful scaffolding. Another thing that Common Core, trying to be so lean and mean, forgot is to teach prime factorization, very fundamental element of how the numbers are structured. They completely forgot this part, and consequently, they cannot talk about least common denominator or greatest common factors because those are relying on prime factorization. Even when they teach fraction, which is what's supposed to be their strongest point, the Common Core standards completely forgot to teach conversion between different forms of fraction. The regular fractional form, or so-called the common fraction, percents, and decimals. This is a key skill that has been frequently talked about both by the NCTN, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, by the National Research Council, and by the National Advisory Mathematics Panel that was established by President Bush 5 years back, and they also mentioned it as a key skill. Yet all this is missing in the Common Core standards. The truth is that the Common Core was put together pretty rapidly, and in the rush, they didn't have time to do a very good job. It's not that the people that did it were not wise or intelligent, but they were under time pressure. They had to do something so it would be ready for the race to the top, and the results show it's really not ready for prime time. There is another point that maybe it's worth mentioning. Many proponents of the Common Core point out, and correctly, that the Common Core does call for fluency with the 4 arithmetic operations, which many state standards do not call for explicitly. And this is true. Indeed, the Common Core does call for this fluency, although they call for it a year or two later than our international competitors and many other state standards. Well, you could say better late than never. And indeed, it is better late than never. However, this is not as innocuous as one might think, because it allows for additional year or two of exposing students to a variety of invented algorithms, of individual ways of trying to solve arithmetic problems. And this really confuses them, because when they eventually come to the standard algorithm, they frequently do not understand the importance of the standard algorithm and the efficiency of standard algorithm as compared to the strategies and the invented algorithms that they have been fed for previous many years. So the result is that while the fluency with standard algorithms is mentioned in the Common Core, I expect very few students actually attain this fluency. They will know about it, but they will see it on par with many other invented algorithmic strategies that may or may not work in different cases. In fact, Professor James Milgram, who was a member of the Common Core Validation Committee, noticed this, and he observed in his testimony in front of the California Academic Standards Commission, and quote, within the document itself seems to be a minor war going on, and this is not something we should hand over to our teachers. This minor war between, on one hand, the standard algorithm, and on the other hand, the strategies, the invented algorithms, and essentially effort to have students discover their own ways of mathematics. The result of it, as I said, is not innocuous, and because the Common Core can be read multiple ways, because the language is so unclear and has different sections in different grades, different kind of textbook can claim that they are aligned with it. And they can say with straight face that whether they are on the extreme reform side, very fuzzy, or they are very rigorous, very traditional, both of them could claim they are aligned with the Common Core. So that label aligned with Common Core actually means very little. And this is another danger. But perhaps the biggest marker of the low level or mediocre, not low level is possibly too strong, but mediocre level of the Common Core is that it does not expect middle school students to take algebra by grade 8. Not every student is expected in every state to take algebra by grade 8, and this is fine. You cannot expect students to do it unless they're well prepared, and not all the students are well prepared, we know that. However, this has been the goal of our system in the United States for over a decade, to push more and more students into taking algebra earlier so they can actually take a more advanced mathematics in the high school. This has been the recommendation of the National Mathematics Advisory Panel. This has been the push of all of the educational establishment. Yet the Common Core abandoned this goal, and they directly pushed algebra as a high school course. This is a clear sign of the lowered expectations that we in the Common Core holds for our students. Now, many of the proponents will say, but we put some algebra in grade 8. Indeed, they did. But that's what made grade 8 essentially a pre-algebra. What is a pre-algebra? It's a math course that has some bits and pieces of algebra. And that's really what grade 8 Common Core Mathematics is. Again, the evidence is that there is an Algebra 1 course, but it's not in the middle school, it's in the high school. So by their own tacit admission, algebra is moved to grade 9, even though they try to cover it up in some way, saying, oh no, we do tend to have some algebra in grade 8. I would like now to move to, rather than from the specific to the more general. There have been a handful of studies done to compare the Common Core to other nations and other states, high-achieving nations, high-achieving states, and find how well does the Common Core stand up to them. Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who you will hear soon, and myself, we did such a study in 2010, and our summary conclusion in mathematics was as follows. Common Core project was a laudable effort to shape a national curriculum. Unfortunately, rather than build on the strengths that can be documented in Massachusetts or California, the draft writers chose to navigate an uncharted path. Consequently, although they sometimes include an interesting treatment of several new ideas that are potentially useful for the development or implementation of a standard, by grade 8, their standards are a year or two behind the National Mathematics Advisory Panel's recommendation, behind leading states, and behind our international competitors. In other words, we found them weak. Dr. Jonathan Goodman, professor of mathematics at the Courant Institute at the New York University, also studied and compared the Common Core with international high achievers, and his conclusions were: the proposed Common Core standard is similar in earlier grades, but has a significantly lower expectations with respect to algebra and geometry than the published standards of other countries I examined. The Common Core standard document is prepared with less care and is less useful to teachers and math ed administrators than other standards I examined. In other words, again, Professor Goodman found them lacking compared to international competitors. I mentioned Dr. Milgram, who was also on the Common Core Validation Committee, and he did his own study as part of this validation committee and testified about them in front of our California Academic Content Standard Commission. His summary was, quote, The above standards illustrate many serious flaws in the common core standards, And also among those difficulties are that a large number of the arithmetics and operations, as well as place value standards, are 1, 2, or even more years behind the corresponding standards for many, if not all, the high-achieving countries. Consequently, I was not able to certify the core mathematics standard or benchmark at the same level as the standards of the high-achieving countries in mathematics. Indeed, Dr. Milgram is one of the people that could not sign off on the Common Core standards, and his letter is attached to the back of my testimony. I hope that you got a copy of, or you hold it in front of you. But those are people directly involved in mathematics. The next study comes from Dr. Andrew Porter, Dean of Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, Dr. Porter had done other comparative studies of state curricula, and he is not a mathematician, yet listen to his conclusions. Quote, "Those who hope that the Common Core standards represent greater focus for US education will be disappointed by our answers. Only one of our criteria for measuring focus found that the Common Core standards are more focused than the current state standards. How much focus is desirable is unknown, but clearly the Common Core standards could have been more focused than they are. We also used international benchmarking to judge the quality of the Common Core standards, and the results are surprising both for mathematics and for English language arts and reading, ELAR. Top achieving countries for which we had content standard put greater emphasis on performance procedure than do the US Common Core standards. High-performing countries' emphasis on perform procedures runs counter to the widespread call in the United States for greater emphasis on higher-order cognitive demand." I would like to touch on this again a little bit, explain. Major theme running through the promoter of Common Core that they're supposed to be deeper and develop critical thinking. And I think all of us are for critical thinking. I don't know anyone who is against it. The big question is how one develops it. Now, some people believe that if we talk about critical thinking and throw big items at students, big and deep items at students, they somehow will develop critical thinking. Other people believe more like in music. You start with scale and you practice. And at a certain point, you are able to perform complex compositions. Same thing with mathematics. You do procedures and you become fluent and manipulating numbers and using numbers to solve problems, regular problems, and the depths and critical thinking develops from that. It has to be built on basic skill. And that's what Professor Porter mentioned, that all the high-achieving countries focus on performing procedure, which is building the skills before they dive into critical thinking. Yet Common Core seems to be focusing more on the critical thinking aspect without sufficient basis. Those are all studies that found the Common Core lacking. Yet recently, last year actually, there was a new study by Professor Bill Schmidt and Richard Huang from the Michigan State University that also compared the Common Core mathematics with curricula of other high-achieving countries. And in contrast with the other studies, their findings were different. Let me quote, "There being no major difference between the two sets of standards," they compared the 6 countries on the teams and the Common Core, "this provides further evidence that the Common Core state standards in mathematics are coherent and very consistent with the international benchmarks." In other words, in contrast with all the other studies, Professor Schmidt found that the Common Core actually is coherent and consistent with the international benchmarks. How can it be? I hope you have the handout, as I mentioned, because there are 2 pages at the back of the handout that are talking directly to the study of Schmidt. And unfortunately, I have to report to you that their study, which was published in a peer reference journal, actually, their conclusions are not supported by their own data and their own evidence. If you look at the page before last, there are two tables there, table on the left and table on the right. So it's named Figure 1 and Figure 2. Figure 1 is a picture of how a curriculum of the high-achieving teams nations looks like. And if you look at this table, it has rows that describe mathematical topics. And it has columns that are the grade levels, grade 1 to 8. Now, if you look at the order of the rows, you see that it starts with whole number meaning, whole number iteration, basically with simple basic things to start very early. And it builds up. Mathematics is hierarchical after all. And as you see, it creates this characteristic triangular shape, kind of upper right triangular shape, that simple topics start early, more complex topics built on the simpler topics start late, and they progress through the grade, but no topic really lasts forever. This is a very characteristic shape that shows focus and coherent progression. The coherence is the order of the row. If simple topics come first, complex topics come later, and then introduced later. None of them lasts forever, although the simpler topics obviously permeate everything, so they last a bit longer. So this shows, as I repeat myself, but coherence in the order of the row, and the focus in the sense that topics don't cover all the 8 grades, but typically 3-4 grades at most. One learns them, one finishes learning them, and moves on to the next topic. Figure 2 is very similar mapping that Professor Schmidt did in this paper that is of the common core. And if you look, it's very similar shape. It's a bit thicker, but that's understandable. But overall, the shape is very, very similar. So this was the main reason why in his paper, Professor Schmidt and his colleague said that the common core is coherent and consistent with international benchmarks. When he said international benchmark, he meant the team's countries on the right. And indeed, the shape do look similar. But there is a problem. If you go to the last page of the handout, you will see that Professor Schmidt reordered order of the rows on the right. In other words, figure 2 with a common core, the rows are reordered compared to the original coherent order on the left. So suddenly, things like 3D geometry are introduced before 2D geometry basics. Things like relation between common core and decimal fractions are introduced before decimal fractions are even introduced. So let me repeat what Professor Schmidt and his colleague did on the right. They reordered the rows to get to this triangular shape, but suddenly they scrambled any coherence and sequence that was in the order of the row because they wanted to achieve the illusion of the same shape. So this is a very misleading chart, and based on this chart and Professor Schmidt and Huang conclusions, the proponent of the common core now claim, oh, we have evidence that the common core is indeed coherent and consistent with international benchmark. No, it is not. Even Professor Schmidt data, if displayed correctly, will show they're not similar. In summary, the middle school content of the common core falls 1 or 2 years behind our high-achieving international competitors, and they are not as rigorous and coherent as people claim. Let me move on now to the second issue, and this will be faster a bit. The issue of college readiness. A major reason for distance is that all of our high school students are now suddenly supposed to be college ready. Until the Common Core, high school graduation meant just that, high school graduation. Now suddenly it's supposed to mean college readiness. Yet our children have not changed. They are the same children, and we always knew that not every child is ready for college. But declaring that high school graduation will equal from now on college readiness, effectively, we had to dump down the college readiness, otherwise we would fail a major fraction of high school students, which is obviously politically unacceptable. So this is really what happened, but people that promote Common Core typically do not mention it. Yet it's not a secret. Jason Zimba, one of the lead authors of the mathematics standard, testified in front of the Massachusetts Board of Education in 2010 that the Common Core's concept of college readiness is minimal and focuses on non-selective colleges. Minimal and focuses on non-selective colleges. In other words, it's basically either community colleges and very few four-year colleges. The Common Core high school courses typically include only part of the content that you find in regular high school courses. So while the names are the same, Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Geometry, the content is typically lacking and partial. So it's a weaker set of Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and Geometry, even if the names are maintained. And consequently, if you have today problem with college remediation, students that are considered college ready with this new diluted content courses have an even bigger problem. Everybody requires these three courses at least, including Oklahoma, but the content will be diluted. Let me spend a couple of moments talking about the requirements for college. I mentioned already that typically it's Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and Geometry. But this is a marginal requirement, and we can see this from California data. California has a system where we test in grade 11 our students, and if they meet certain performance criteria, they are guaranteed to be placed in non-remedial courses in our California State University system. So we have been collecting data on this thing for close to 10 years right now. And the data is unambiguous. If you are only taking up to Algebra 2, students that are only taking Algebra 2 and then take this test, only 7% of them, very small fraction, is ready, considered ready for college, and another 22% of them are conditional ready. In other words, if they take another year of math, they will probably be ready. If, however, by grade 11, when this test is taken, a student has taken a course beyond Algebra 2, then suddenly the numbers are very different. 22% are completely ready and 67% conditionally ready. In other words, almost 90% are ready for college after a course beyond Algebra 2. In other words, Algebra 2 is marginal content to be ready for college. We say this is a minimal thing, and now we are diluting the content. Clearly, this is not something that will improve our college-going rates and college-going success. When Jason Zimba, this lead writer of the math standard, was asked about the meaning of the common college readiness, another thing that he said was, it is good for colleges that most kids go to, but not for the colleges most parents aspire to. not only not for STEM, it is also not for selective colleges. For example, for UC Berkeley, whether you are going to be an engineer or not, you'd better have pre-calculus to get into UC Berkeley. Well, Common Core does not provide for pre-calculus content. So all the argument that we need the Common Core to be competitive in the global marketplace and for STEM and so on, this seems to be an empty talk unsupported by evidence. Finally, let me go to the last part of my testimony. What is the benefit of national standards? The national standards argue that they are important for comparability across states, to ease students' move across state lines, and economics of scales. There is also an argument that says, well, every high-achieving country has national standards. Maybe we should start with the last. It is true that every international high achiever has national standards. It is also true that every international lagger and unachieving country has national standards, because overwhelming number of countries around the world have national standards. Only a handful of countries, like United States, like Canada, like Australia, used to be Germany, not anymore, that have distributed federal-like system of autonomous states. And they do not have necessarily nationalized curriculum. All the other countries do have. So by definition, all the successful countries, all the failing countries have national curriculum. It means nothing. Comparability is another issue that says, argues for having national standards. Yet we have comparability already, and we have had it for more than 20 years, 30 years. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, provide this kind of cross-state measurement, and we have been using it for many, many years. There is no reason to know that Johnny in Oklahoma, or Oklahoma City, how Johnny compares to somebody in Sacramento, California. That's not the point. The point is to know how Oklahoma City overall is doing against Sacramento, or how Oklahoma does against California. And we have it already. There are other ways also to do it. And many people have been using tests that are available across the nation, private tests like the MAP, from Northwest Evaluation Association, and there are other possibilities. Cross-state mobility is a very small fraction, and to use it to justify nationalized curriculum seems strange. There is less than 1.7% of students that move across state line every year. This is the US Census Bureau data, and it includes military and everybody. 1.7% of students. And the argument that they will have a bit easier time to move across state line seems to be disingenuous. And economies of state, that may be an argument that is feasible for very small state like Rhode Island or Vermont. You are not such a small state. And in any case, many states can come together and decide to collaborate on purchasing agreement, on some other thing. But they don't need somebody from Washington to force them into collaboration and crack a whip if they misstep in this collaboration. In summary, the Common Core math standards are mediocre based on any international benchmark, despite claims to the contrary. Moreover, their prescriptive nature will require Oklahoma to replace much of its teacher training and professional development by content developed in Washington, D.C., and take away much of your teacher's autonomy in the classroom. Finally, the Common Core standards will tie Oklahoma's hands to Washington bureaucrats and will take your ability to care for your own children the way you want, rather than those people in Washington want. A year ago, in the face of the anti-Common Core rumblings in South Carolina, Ernie Duncan, our Secretary of Education, wrote, quote, the idea that the Common Core standards are nationally imposed is a conspiracy theory in search of conspiracy. A few months later, President Obama had a State of the Union, the 2013 State of the Union, where he said, quote, 4 years ago, we have started the race to the top, a competition that convinced almost every state to develop smarter curricula and higher standards, all for about 1% of what we spent on education each year. He's bragging about it, that the federal government got all the states to cave in on the chip for 1% of what they spend each year. Which one of them should we believe? Thank you for your time.
We are honored to have at least one of our senators with us today, and if there are others in the room other than Senator Sharp, we're glad to have you. So feel free to join into the Q&A. We're not sure if Dr. Werman is going to be able to hear your question, so what we'll do is we'll try this once, and then if he cannot hear, I'll have to repeat the question so that he can hear it. So Dr. Werman, are you hearing me just fine?
Yes, I am.
All right, thank you. Who is the first? Is it Representative Kern? All right, Representative Kern.
Thank you. Dr. Werman, can you hear me?
Yes, kind of.
Kind of. Okay. You mentioned that the NAEP provides a comparative standard, yet I've heard that not all students have to take the NAEP. Will all students have to take the Common Core assessments?
Right. It is true that the NAEP does not allow to compare student to student, and that is not its role. The importance and the interest of the legislators is to understand how the systems are doing, and that's what NAEPs allow, comparability across states and sometimes across cities. And it does not need to test every student for that. If you want to know how Johnny in Oklahoma is doing versus Mary in California, yes, you need to test everyone. But why does it matter? You can adjust based on Mary's students in California or based on Mary's score in California, you can adjust it to the NAEP score if you want to, if you really want to compare them. But there is absolutely no reason. You can do it, but nobody cares.
Okay, may I have a follow-up?
Certainly.
Okay, you mentioned that the sequence of how mathematics is going to be taught is not always an appropriate one. I know you're not a psychologist, but does teaching things out of sequence, how does that affect a student and their learning?
I'm not sure I think I missed this piece about the sequence.
Yeah, Dr. Werman, let me repeat the question. Basically, what Representative Kern is asking is if you change the sequence of learning in mathematics from the standard to what the Common Core would do, does that have some type of effect on the student? Would it have a psychological effect, or how would it affect their learning ability if you change the sequence of the standards that they're learning?
That's a very good question, because the answer is we really don't know. We know that if you make the sequence incoherent, it will not work. But by that, it doesn't mean that there is one coherent sequence, because in fact, there are many coherent possible sequences throughout the curriculum. And if you look at high-achieving countries, and you compare the curriculum of, say, Korea to Singapore, they are very different curricula, yet both of them are very successful. So we know that, teaching a student comparing A to B before you teach them what A is or what B is makes no sense. That's an incoherent curriculum. However, you can design multiple paths through the curriculum that are coherent, yet widely different and successful. So there is no one particular sequence that we know works.
All right, I believe that Representative Shelton is next. Representative Shelton.
Thank you so much. I don't know. Can you hear me?
So far, so good.
All right. Have you, before you came to do this testimony today, did you do any research into Oklahoma and to see what Oklahoma is doing in relationship to our schools? Or is this, or are your statements just broad just across the table? Is it just a broad statement, all states should be doing what you recommended, or is it, did you look at Oklahoma to see things such as how we're the worst state in per pupil spending in the country when making these assessments?
I'm sorry, the echoes made it hard to understand. Can you please repeat the question?
Let me see if I can try, and Representative Shelton, you help me. I think the question was, in preparing for your testimony today, did you do any specific research on Oklahoma and what we do here, or are your statements just basically across the board and would apply to all states, or are you considering our particular situation here in Oklahoma? Is that correct?
Okay, thank you for the question. I actually did at your past standards. I read through them. I looked a little bit at your assessment, and I actually liked your standards, although I liked your standard, although what I was missing was a crisp definition of capstone goals. So I personally think that your standards could be improved a bit. But I like their clarity, and I like the fact that you have your major objectives specified for each grade level. Many states don't have this definition for each grade level, and they have just a list of standards, and then it's left to the teachers to decide what's important and what's less important. In fact, that's exactly the situation with the Common Core, that they don't have a list of priorities attached with each grade level, and that has to be worked out by either by the state or by local district. And so in this sense, I find the Oklahoma standards very helpful, but they could benefit from additional clarity of specifying the end goals of particular milestones in mathematical progression. I hope this answers the question.
You have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. My question to you is if you have followed Oklahoma or done any research to Oklahoma at all, you know that we're worse in the country in per pupil spending. We cut more out of education than any state in the whole entire United States. The question, and I'm trying to frame it just right, is that you brought up California, you brought up Massachusetts several times during your testimony today. Is there any correlation in your belief that spending has to do is directly tied to quality of education that children receive?
If I understood you correctly, you are asking whether there is any correlation one can observe between the quality of the standards and the quality of the results, if you wish. That's correct?
That's pretty close, but good enough.
Okay. It's a complicated question and a complicated answer. I would say that if you have good standard, it is helpful to create good achievement, but it's not sufficient. On the other hand, if you have bad standards, or not so much bad as much as ill-defined or confused or unclear, it is very unhelpful to the system. But it's not necessarily going to cause a failure of the system, because the success and failure of system depends on many components. Depends on teacher training, depends on implementation in the classroom, depends on the standard, depends on the instructional materials. So if you have a small country, like Singapore, for example, where they have really one big teacher education school, you can actually have pretty mediocre standards, if you wish, or pretty fuzzy standards in terms of clarity, and still do very well because there is one body that interprets it for all teachers. So all teachers have a very coherent, very clear understanding anyway what is expected of them. So therefore the system will be very uniform and quite possibly good. Other countries that have also some very strong structure of understanding and homogeneity may not need very explicit standards because certain things are understood in this society, and therefore the standards don't have to spell it out. So for an outsider, it will look like those standards are lacking or are unclear, but in reality, they are good enough for that particular society. So that's part of an answer. But also you mentioned Massachusetts and California, and those are, I think, excellent examples because Massachusetts had very good standard and excellent implementation. And therefore, it moved from having mediocre achievement over time into having the best achievement in the nation. But it was not only because of the standards. It was also because of the professional development, because of the teacher training, because of teacher certification, because of good assessment. All together were needed to have this overall excellent success. California is the other example where you had excellent standards, but the system did not implement the teacher training, the professional development as well as it could. Consequently, the success of California has been much more muted. And I say success of California, even though a lot of people will say, what success? California is not successful. I'd like to correct this impression. In 1995 or so, California was at the bottom of the states in terms of NAEP achievement. It was number 2 from the bottom, I believe. Since then, California moved up maybe 10 places, so we are today maybe around number 10 to 15 from the bottom. Not a big deal, you would say. Yet, if you consider that at the same time, California underwent a significant demographic change. Our population of Latino students in 1990s was on the order of 40%. Today, it's over 50%. The Hispanic population typically has a lower achievement, and its share in the population grew significantly. Yet we climbed up from the bottom of the heap to somewhere a little bit above the bottom. If you consider the demographic change, we should actually be somewhere in the middle. Still nothing close to Massachusetts' success, but pretty decent and pretty impressive change. I hope I answered your question.
Did a great job.
One more follow-up, and then we're going to go to Representative Kern.
No, I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your allowing me to ask these questions. The next question I have for you is, do you have any suggestions for rural and urban districts that are often forced to hire retrained, underqualified, and possibly temporary teachers to fill, to teach many of our math programs because they have such a hard time recruiting teachers into the state of Oklahoma due to the low pay and lack of resources?
Could you repeat the question, please, somebody there? I'm sorry, I missed the second half of the question.
Let me see if I can do this. In relation to some of the rural and urban schools that have to hire retrained teachers to fill gaps in the mathematics teaching. Excuse me?
You forgot the word underqualified and temporary teachers.
Okay, retrained, underqualified, and temporary teachers to teach the math. So then what was the rest of the question?
Do you see any? Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on how Oklahoma can encourage math teachers, those highly qualified in math, to move to the state of Oklahoma when we're having such a hard time due to low pay and low resources for our teachers?
Did you hear that last part, Dr. Werman?
Not really. If you
Okay.
could repeat it, I would
So
appreciate
to fill these gaps in the math teaching positions, would you have any suggestion for a state, according to Representative Shelton, that doesn't pay enough? What can we do to recruit better teachers into the math sciences?
I don't really have a good answer for that. I can tell you that when California moved into teaching algebra by grade 8, it took us almost a decade to fill in enough qualified teachers in the middle school. It was a long process. I can tell you that the Common Core, while it is not necessarily more challenging or more demanding than anybody's curriculum or your own curriculum in this particular case, it does represent a reshuffling of content. For example, they push a lot of geometry into grade 8. So suddenly your middle school teachers will have to train themselves in geometry. Typically, they do not have any experience in teaching geometry in middle school, serious geometry. Not much, but they need something. Another example is that the issue of negative numbers that was typically taught, in earlier grades, starting maybe in grade 4 or 5, now it's pushed into the middle school, starting only in grade 6. So that puts the onus on middle school teachers to teach negative numbers, while the elementary teachers now don't have to teach it, but teach some other material about fractions and similar. So the reshuffling of content implies that there has to be done a lot of professional training if you adopt the Common Core, while the overall rigor and expectations of the system do not become necessarily higher, they become different. And that calls for a lot of professional development. And in my opinion, 40 hours or 80 hours is insufficient in most cases. Dr. Stotsky, who will follow me later, has much more experience than I do in terms of how to handle the professional training aspect. So maybe you should repeat the question to her. But beyond what I said, that there is a significant reshuffling of content without necessarily escalating the expectations is very important, I think, in mathematics.
Representative Kern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Verman, you, in your last answer, you mentioned geometry, and that's what my question deals with, because it was not addressed anywhere in your presentation. So geometry is being bumped down to the 8th grade, and what about the sequence in which it is taught? Will it be looked at in any other grades?
Excellent question, because geometry is indeed very strangely handled in the Common Core. It starts fast and furious in very early grades. So there is a lot of expectation, for example, of very young students in grade 1 and 2 to deal and characterize three-dimensional shapes, which seems premature and unnecessarily demanding and potentially confusing. Then it slows down, and it essentially meanders throughout the grades in such a way that areas of triangles and the sum of angles of triangles are touched on only in the middle school rather than already discussed and developed in the higher elementary grades. Then we come to the end of middle school, grade 8, where chunks of normal high school geometry are pushed down into the grade 8, Not many of them, but few of them. And more interestingly, they are pushed not only in terms of content. Congruence of triangle, for example, is discussed in grade 8 already, except that they also, the Common Core insists on particular experimental pedagogy to teach congruence of triangle. Rather than the traditional way of teaching triangle congruence, they are using what's so-called rigid transformations, which is a pedagogy that was tried in a couple of places around the world, and it failed. It was tried in Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s, I believe, and it was tried somewhere in Belgium at a certain point in time, and both of them proved to be abject failure, and they reverted very quickly from that. This is the method that is pushed in grade 8 and in high school geometry of teaching congruence. So as I said, part of it was pushed to grade 8 with this questionable experimental pedagogy. Then there is a geometry course in high school. Now, this is not your traditional geometry course. On one hand, it has a lot of algebra and algebraic manipulation pushed into it. So it's more analytical geometry than traditional geometry. There is much more focus on algebraic manipulations of geometric shape, which one can argue is good or bad, but it's questionable because the algebraic preparation of the students will be still weak. And this requires a lot of facility with algebraic manipulation. On the other hand, some of the more deep geometric theorems and topics are actually barely touched on in the geometry course. So it's a mixed bag of features, starting, as I said, in early grades, fast and furious, then slowing down and meandering until the middle school, then applying some experimental approach in the middle school, and then high school, which is kind of strange, a bit modified geometry from what we used to know. I hope this helps you.
Thank you, yes.
Dr. Warman, I have a question, and my question is, in your opinion, who is best suited to set the standards for their schools, the states or a group in Washington, D.C.?
I obviously believe that this is eventually the state's role to set the standards. It's perfectly reasonable to look at other people. But as I said before, there are many ways to reach the same goals. There are many sequences to reach the same goals. If I may offer something, a year or more ago, Bill Gates published a big op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. And his argument, I remember then, was, well, there is only, why should we have a different way to teach children how to do some arithmetic operation? I don't remember. Maybe he was talking about multiplication of numbers, of adding and subtracting. And his kind of common sense question was, why should there be so many ways to teach addition and subtraction, say? And on the first reading, it made sense. On the second reading, it made absolutely no sense, because we do not know if there is a right way to teach addition and subtraction. As I said, you look at Korea, you look at Japan, you look at Taiwan, you look at Singapore. They're all highly successful, but each one of them teaches math differently. So yes, we know that we more or less want to get somewhere at about some time, but not precise time. But how to get there, we have no idea. And I believe each state should have the right and the obligation to try to do the best by their own children, while looking outside to learn from them.
Well, Dr. Werman, we're about out of time and need to take a break. I want to thank you so much for presenting to us today and taking your time, and all of you have asked questions. Thank you so very, very much. So with that, we will take a break, 15-minute break.
If I may, one thing.
Yes, sir.
I wanted, obviously, to thank you, but I also want to correct the record. I am not a doctor, and didn't want to start from that, but I don't have a PhD, so please remember that. Thank you.
All right. Let's take a break. We'll come back in at 2:15. I see that we have Dr. Stotsky on the Skype, so she's up on our monitor. Before we begin, Ms. Stotsky, I'd like to give the group here a little bit of an introduction for you, if that's all right.
Of course.
Dr. Stotsky is credited with developing one of the country's strongest sets of academic standards for K through 12 students, as well as the strongest academic standards and licensure tests for prospective teachers while serving as Senior Associate Commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education from 1999 to 2003. She is also known nationwide for her in-depth analysis of the problems in Common Core's English language arts standards. Her current research ranges from the deficiencies in teacher preparation programs and teacher licensure tests to the deficiencies in the K through 12th reading curriculum and the question of gender bias in the curriculum. She is regularly invited to testify or submit testimony to state boards of education and state legislators on bills addressing licensure tests, licensure standards, and Common Core standards. She currently serves on several committees for the International Dyslexia Association and on the advisory board for Pioneer Institute Center for School Reform. She served on the National Validation Committee for the Common Core State Systemic Initiative from 2009 to 2010, on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel 2006-2008, and is co-authoring its final report as well as two of its task group reports on the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. So with no further ado, we want to turn it over to Dr. Stotsky. It's good to have you here today. Thank you for coming and spending some time with us. So you have from now until 3 o'clock.
Until 3 o'clock, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm on Eastern time, so I'm looking at 3:20 now, so that means until 4 o'clock my time.
All
but
right.
That's certainly plenty. And I thank you very much for the introduction, and I am only regretful that I am not actually in Oklahoma to be with you in person. My talk will focus as cogently and as briefly as I can on the question of the costs involved in implementing the Common Core standards from the perspective of the quality of the standards, the quality of the assessments that you are getting for your money's worth, because the costs really must be looked at in terms of what are you getting for your money's worth. And most of my remarks will be directed towards the English language arts curriculum and the English language arts standards, because that is my area of expertise. Let me first detail the major issues with the English language arts standards that Oklahoma has voted to adopt from the Common Core standards. First of all, most of Common Core's college readiness and grade level reading standards are simply content-free skills. You're not buying very much content. There are a few standards that deal with seminal documents, but I have yet to see a sample testing item that even deals with them. So I am beginning to think that they are mainly there as window dressing. That is the first concern, that you have bought a whole bunch of skills, and skills training alone doesn't prepare students for college. They need a fund of content knowledge. Secondly, Common Core's standards stress writing more than reading at every grade level. And this is a serious issue because your teachers and your parents are going to notice that students are doing a lot more writing than they ever did. Sounds good at first, but the problem is that writing is dependent upon reading, and reading is being short-shrifted in several ways under the Common Core English language arts standards. It looks good to see that kids are going to be doing a lot more writing because we know they all need to learn how to do better writing, even when they're in college. But the basic problem, and it's a matter of research and common sense, is that good writing follows good reading, and you need an awful lot of good reading to internalize the structure of a good English sentence and to become a better writer. And if you simply count the standards, there are more writing than reading standards at every grade level. Third, we're getting to what English teachers need to do, which is at the high school level a serious problem. From K to 12, Common Core mandates in an unusual way that all the reading instruction that teachers give in the English or reading class must be divided between 10 informational reading standards and 9 literary standards. In K through 6, this is not a problem for the elementary teacher in a self-contained elementary classroom where she typically teaches all the other subjects over the course of the day. By the time you get to the subject-divided classroom day, which is very common in middle schools and is certainly the common way of dividing the school day in high school, this means that that one period of English per day, when the teacher is going to do reading, that teacher is going to address informational texts at least half the time from grade 9, from grade 6 to grade 12. Now, you do simple arithmetic. What this means is if you've added more informational, so-called informational text, you have lowered the amount of literary text that you are teaching. Now, some people think this might be a good idea. However, it is not a good idea if you are thinking about the development of critical thinking, which is something Common Core claims it is promoting. Critical thinking is developed in the English class by English teachers who teach students how to read between the lines. They develop a fund of knowledge in other areas, but the main way they learn to read between the lines is with complex literary texts. After all, they're not being taught to read between the lines for their science and history textbooks. Those are informational materials that students are supposed to learn from, not to question and read between the lines of. That's not their purpose. So by reducing literary study, complex literary study in the English class, and increasing something called informational text, which English teachers have never been trained to teach, you are reducing opportunities to develop critical thinking. Moreover, it opens the floodgate for all kinds of peculiar things called informational texts, little snippets of articles here and there that deal with computer nerds. I've seen these titles mentioned in curriculum sample materials, or other kinds of material on how teenagers are approached by commercial advertisers, things that aren't any part of a body of systematic information. The problem is that it fragments the English curriculum even more than it has been already, and it needed to be made more coherent rather than less coherent. The next issue is relating to Common Core's writing standards, which turn out to be developmentally inappropriate at many grade levels. I've been looking particularly at middle school, where the reading and the writing standards simply aren't coordinated. Little children are asked in grades 6, sometimes 5, to come up with a claim about something they are going to write that relates to a piece of reading. Most children that age don't know what a claim is. They might know what a baggage claim is, but they don't know what a claim, a piece of writing, is. And they're not given the appropriate reading materials if you look at what is in Common Core's reading standards. Even more recently, early childhood educators have been talking about the inappropriateness of the early childhood standards, because it asks kindergarten students to do things that you would need far more mature children to do. So we have a lot of issues with various aspects of Common Core's standards, but let me summarize some of the major issues that came out of my being on the validation committee for Common Core. And I must tell you that I can't tell you what we did on that committee because we all had to sign confidentiality agreements at our first meeting yes, and I want to emphasize that I was certainly not prepared for a confidentiality agreement. I've been on many civic committees in my home community as an adult, all during my lifetime, and I was on the Massachusetts State Board of Education. We never signed confidentiality agreements, but that meant that we could never talk about what this committee did, any documents it might come out with, if it came out with any, but I can tell you about why I did not sign off at the end of the year when we were all asked to sign off on certain criteria for having been on this committee. I learned by that time, if not early, that we were expected to be basically rubber stamps. And I have never been a rubber stamp on any committee I've been on. I always ask questions. And we learned that basically that was all that was required of us. And I didn't sign on, nor did the only mathematician on the validation committee sign off either. We didn't sign off for the same reasons. That was first because Common Core standards are not internationally benchmarked or comparable to the best standards elsewhere. And you'd have to find out from CCSSO or the National Governors Association, the two groups that sponsored these standards, what countries they thought we were being benchmarked to, because we could never find out. So they're not benchmarked to comparable standards elsewhere. They lack a research base, and they also lack credible authors. This is something that the media should have picked up, but it didn't. Now, by a credible author, I mean, what are the credentials of the people who wrote the English language arts standards? We know who they were physically. They were Sue Pimentel and David Coleman. They're always regularly referred to as the chief architects of the English language arts standards by Common Core. Their lack of experience shows in every way. Neither of them had ever taught in K-12 or in higher ed. Neither of them had ever written any serious articles about curriculum and instruction or literary study, anything relating to the English language arts. Why they were chosen, we still don't know. All of this is confidential and material that can't even be FOIA'd, because the two organizations that developed and sponsored the standards are private organizations, and they even benchmarked the standards, so that your state of Oklahoma can't even change the standards. You can add 15% more to them, which will, of course, not be tested, because the common tests will be based only on the standards these inexperienced people wrote. So those are the things you need to know about what you got for your money's worth when you adopted Common Core's standards. Mainly skills, little content, and it seems to me that if you're implementing a set of standards, you are wasting your money if those standards are Common Core's. You're going to have to spend a lot of money on professional development for teachers, and it will be never-ending because, as we know from the research on professional development, there is almost no research suggesting the benefits of professional development in any content area. Unfortunately, states and local school districts spend a lot of money, often by law, on professional development. And when I was on the National Math Panel, we did an extensive review of the research, and there's almost no benefit from professional development. You're also going to be spending, as you already know, a lot of money on the technology for the assessments. We don't even know what their quality is. And here is where I want to start suggesting what Oklahoma, as well as all the other states I have testified in, should be thinking of doing. You should be asking your teaching faculty in your own institutions of higher education, University of Oklahoma and other institutions of higher education in your state, and I mean particularly the math, science, and engineering faculty that you have who teach undergraduates. They are the ones who should be examining the college readiness level of Common Core standards to see whether that is indeed what they agree with, or do they see problems in Common Core's college readiness level. I am still astonished that not one Board of Education, including Oklahoma's State Board of Education and Massachusetts State Board of Education, ever bothered to ask the teaching faculty at its own universities to look at these so-called college readiness standards and tell them what they thought about them. This is a serious gap, and you could, as a legislature, request your own higher ed teaching faculty not only to examine Common Cores capable of developing with your high school teachers of math, science, and English the right admissions test. They are, not somebody in Washington, not somebody connected to two private trade organizations who've copyrighted their standards. It makes no sense to me. And here is where you will get the quality you want for your state. They will want to work with your own high school teachers to develop the admissions tests that will make sense for what they know in teaching high school graduates of Oklahoma high schools. You would have one set of teaching faculty for math, science, and engineering with high school teachers of math and science, and then you might have a reading test developed by English teachers and literary scholars. Who better should know what is needed by Oklahoma high school students? One of the interesting observations I made, but no reporters seem to have made, when all the people on the standards development committees were announced by the National Governors Association and CCSSO, the observation was that there were no English professors or high school English teachers on any of these committees. There wasn't one on the validation committee. There wasn't one high school math teacher on the validation committee whose charge was to ensure that these standards were rigorous. How can elementary teachers decide how rigorous a set of high school math standards are? They wouldn't have been able to notice, as Professor Milgram has been able to notice, that there are no pre-calculus standards in Common Core and very few trigonometry standards. So lo and behold, despite the fact that we have been told by the current USED that everyone is concerned about STEM, STEM meaning science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the pipeline to it, there is no pipeline to STEM majors at the college level from Common Core standards. So not only are you buying a flawed set of English standards, you're buying a damaging set of math standards because they will not prepare any of your high school students for a STEM four-year major in math or engineering or science or finance or business or any of the other majors that now require a higher level introductory mathematics course. This, to me, is astonishing and has not been commented on by CCSSO in its own Common Core documents or by all those who are so-called proponents of Common Core. How are you going to handle the STEM pipeline when the standards aren't even there? And the tests certainly won't cover, in the math part of the Common Core college readiness test, they won't cover the missing pieces because the test has to be based on what's there. So you have a serious problem. It's going to happen in your higher ed institutions once lower ed, K-12, has thoroughly adopted Common Core's mathematics standards. So I have two other short recommendations. If you want to have high quality standards for K-12, certainly you are free for English language arts to use a version of the Massachusetts standards that I have made available without any charge on my homepage at the University of Arkansas. I have a complete document for English language arts standards for K-12 that anyone is free to adopt, adapt, revise, do anything with they want. For math, I would recommend that the state legislature consider recommending and paying for Singapore Math's original K-6 math series. There is no better series out on the market, and it has used in Singapore for students whose first language is not English. So it is designed for students whose first language is not English. It focuses on key quantitative terms. I think that's where I'm going to stop now because I really would like to hear whatever questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stotsky. Let's see who's up. Representative Kern, do you have a question? Or?
I have several.
All right. Well, fire away with the first one.
Okay, Dr. Stotsky, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. You talk about the cost for technology, and the test will be taken on these computers, and they're adaptive tests.
Right.
Can you explain what is meant by an adaptive test?
A computer adaptive test means that when you do an item and it turns out to be a more difficult item for the child, the next couple of items or more that the child will be led to will be easier. If a child successfully handles one test item, then the next one may be more difficult. That's why it's called adaptive, because it goes according to whatever the child does on a particular test item. And it does mean that children across classrooms and across states may be working on different test items depending upon how successfully they've performed.
Follow up.
Sure.
So, in other words, when they say Common Core is to create a system so we can adequately compare one state to another, that's not really the case when you're using an adaptive test. How would that work?
It's going to be difficult. There are technical ways of trying to equate what happens, but it's certainly not going to be a straightforward comparison of the specific test items that have been done. Right now, if Oklahoma wants to know how its kids compare to other states, you already can do that through the National Assessment of Educational Progress tests. They give you, because that was required by No Child Left Behind in 2001, you have to take these every 2 years at a state level. It doesn't sample every child, just a random stratified sample, but you can see how many kids you have at the highest level of performance, at the lowest level of performance, and at two other categories in the middle. So you already have a sense of not only where your average is compared to the averages of other states and the whole country's average, but you also can see how many high performers and low performers you have. You already can do that for getting a picture, a snapshot, a profile of your own state performance. So I don't know how much more information you're going to be able to get from the claims by Common Core and what good it'll do you. I mean, why would you want to know where you stand in relation to, say, North Carolina or South Carolina? What good will that do your teachers?
Okay,
I don't know.
One more question
Go
on
ahead.
adaptive testing, and then I'll get out of the queue and let somebody else, but I have more. Okay, will adaptive testing have any impact on the achievement gap?
We really don't know yet because it hasn't taken place and there have been no pilot studies. One of our major problems with Common Core, from a psychometric point of view, is that we simply don't know what's going to happen because there is absolutely no piloting of any of the items. And so we don't know what's going to happen at all. And we can't tell if the gap will be closed or whether it might even be widened. Either is a possibility.
Then I have a follow-up to this same question. Okay, one thing I've heard is since you take two students who are taking a test, one of them answers the first question correctly, the other student does not. The one that answered the question correctly will get a little bit harder question for the next one. The one who did not answer the first question correctly will get a little bit easier question.
Right.
So will this not in some way cause those smarter students to not score as high and those lower students to perhaps score a little bit higher, and so therefore it looks like there has been a shrinking in the achievement gap between the higher levels and lower levels?
We don't know yet. The effects on students are really unknown because none of this has been piloted with information given to the public or to the rest of us who are interested. Sometimes it may be possible to think that students who tackle a harder item will find it easier to get it wrong and then have easier items to get right. We just don't know how to psych it out yet. At least I'm not sure that I know of anyone who has figured out how large numbers of kids are going to handle all of this and the effect on their psychology. This is all unknown territory, and it's just too bad this hasn't been piloted. This particular method of assessment has been piloted. The standards haven't been piloted. Nothing's been piloted. We have a whole nation of guinea pigs for children.
Before I go to Senator Sharp, Dr. Stosky, if I'm getting it correctly, I want to ask this question this way. Is Common Core a lot like the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, that we're actually rolling it out before it's even ready? I mean, before it's even finished, and we don't even know if it will work, and even if it works partially, we don't know the effect that it will have. I mean, are we looking at the same kind of thing?
There are many parallels that people are drawing between the two different focuses, one on healthcare, one on education. I can't speak to healthcare because I haven't focused on the details, but it is the case that we are rolling out a lot of regulations and restrictions and strings that are being attached, including data collection, which nobody expected because it wasn't in the original Common Core document, but goes along with the testing that's going to be done and the money that is being given to states and to other groups by the Gates Foundation, which is interested in promoting the standards, the assessments, and the data collection, which may lend itself to workforce questions that can be answered once you have massive data. But we don't know. The question is a very good one. The approach is similar in that you do things on a grand scale and then worry about the consequences later.
Senator Sharp.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Skosky, my question is here in Oklahoma recently, this Oklahoma State Department of Education has withdrawn Oklahoma from this 22-state consortium, and yet it is being stated that we're staying within Common Core standards. What rationale? This sounds a little bit about fuzzy politics to me. So what would be your comment to that?
I'm sorry, I really didn't hear the last part of your question.
Well, again, this sounds a little bit about fuzzy politics. Whenever we're taking from this 22-state consortium as Common Core is being able to compare our state to other states' benchmarks, what would be the rationale of us as Oklahoma withdrawing from this 22-state consortium of Common Core and then creating and yet still maintaining our own Common Core standards? Is there any rationale there?
If I understand your question, I'll just repeat it. What would be the rationale, or what would you gain by withdrawing from the consortium and developing your own standards? You would certainly gain more control over what you're doing at the state level and at the local level. And from my knowledge of Oklahoma, I was in Arkansas for 5.5 years, and I would say that probably the thinking would be similar among people in both of those states. You want to have more parental involvement and response by schools to what parents are doing or how they see their responsibilities as parents. So you would gain by withdrawing from a consortium that may not allow you to vet or control or alter or change. After all, if you have any problems as a state with any of the standards or the test items, to whom do you complain as a state? You have to get all the other states to agree. It's not clear to me that it's going to get Oklahoma much, if anything, except tangled up with a lot of other states. You do need good standards, but that is a process that needs to be handled at the state level because we certainly didn't get it at the national level. So you would have more opportunity to work out better standards at the local level, and teacher licensing and teacher program approval at the state level, which is where it is situated legally. It is not, teacher licensing and program approval are not done by the federal government, and that is where you really do need to start, particularly at the elementary school level. That's a whole other talk, in a sense, or an area that we can't go into a lot of detail, but if you really want to start improving your schools, and I've said this in testimony to many states, you need to start with raising the academic bar for your prospective elementary teacher and making sure that you have a sound approach to the teaching of reading in your elementary schools. All the rest will follow much better once you can start working on that piece of it. The standards come second, in a sense, but you need to have a higher caliber, academically speaking, elementary or early childhood teacher, and you need to make sure that they are teaching the best that we know for the teaching of reading. And that isn't part of Common Core. So you're not gaining any of that, and you can do that on your own as a state.
Dr. Stotsky, let me redirect the question.
Yes.
What sense would it make to remove ourselves from the consortium but still try to implement Common Core? If we stuck with trying to implement Common Core but we remove ourselves from the other 22 states, what sense does that make?
You still have to have state tests under No Child Left Behind. As I understand the legal situation, even if you got a waiver, you would still have to have a state test. That was under No Child Left Behind. It was a requirement. So either way, you do have to give a state test, and the test must be based on the standards that you have. So if you are keeping Common Core standards, and in English they're mainly skills, and in math they're going to be very low level for the college readiness test, I'm not sure what you're gaining from staying in the consortium. Remember, you're paying for the costs of implementing the test as well as for implementing the curriculum, implementing the standards in the form of whatever curriculum you choose. So you don't gain anything, and I think that was the direction you were going in. If you get out of the consortium and still keep Common Core standards, you haven't given yourself any advantage because you still have to have a state test.
Did that help?
Yes, thank you.
Representative Kern, I think you had other questions.
Yes, sir, I do, if no one else.
We'll
Okay.
fire away one, and then we'll see if
Okay.
any others get in the queue.
Thank you. Dr. Stotsky, it's common knowledge that not only in Oklahoma, but pretty well all over the nation, we have a reading deficiency in our schools. And why is that so? And does Common Core address that? And will Common Core help that at all, in your opinion?
Common Core will not address it any better, the reading problem, than your own standards that you have would. What will address it would be changes, as I just mentioned, I won't go over them, to raising the academic bar for those who go into your education schools and making sure that your licensure test requires your schools of education to teach the right stuff for them. But Common Core won't have anything to do with it, one way or the other. It has one strand of foundational skills. I think they're either called fundamental or foundational skills that are very good. But they also have other strands and other kinds of standards in K to 5. And it will all depend on what your prospective elementary teacher is taught and what the professional development provider tells these teachers to do in their classrooms, so that you may not be able, and by you, I mean your children in your schools may not be able to benefit from that foundational skill strand if it is smothered by other things, a guessing approach, as I would call it, just to simplify matters. Instead of a decoding analytical approach to beginning reading, and I'm talking about beginning reading, you have a guessing approach. That was one of the things I addressed very square on in Massachusetts. We developed a first-class licensure test for reading and made sure that new teachers as well as professional development providers, when reading first existed, we're going to be given the right kinds of professional development and the right approaches to use in the classroom. We think it showed up in the fact that within a few years on NAEP tests, National Assessment of Educational Progress tests, Massachusetts kids went to become first in the country on grade 4 and grade 8 in reading. It's not clear that you can make a tight cause and effect relationship because there are too many variables and factors that affect what kids do in school, but we were able to get more teachers to do the right kind of things in the early grades. But this is something we did on a state level. Whether Common Core can even be that good, we don't know. It hasn't been tried anywhere.
Okay, thank you. Another question I have, you said good writing follows good reading, and the students under Common Core will be asked to do a lot more writing and less reading. So are you saying that the standards do not follow a good progression, a developmental progression?
Right, right.
Is
saying
this...
the emphasis is wrong in Common Core, and the Massachusetts standards, which, as I say, could be seen as one kind of a model because of what happened in the Bay State, are the opposite. If you have more writing than reading standards and teachers spend more time on writing than reading, you're not really going to see the kind of gains that you want. If you have a heavy emphasis on good reading, and I'm talking now about all kinds of reading, broad reading, literary reading, listening to good stories, and so on, better writing is apt to come about later on because students have internalized the vocabulary of complex literature, the technical vocabulary in whatever informational reading they have done. But it's not, it doesn't sound intuitive to say you need to emphasize reading rather than writing if you want to see better writing. But we know from 100 years of research in reading, and we know what good writers will always tell you, that good reading is what matters more. You need to do some writing. I am not saying that you will automatically get good writing if you just do good reading. No, you need to practice writing just as you need to practice sports or anything else. You can't do something you don't practice at all. But the basis for it is what children internalize, the reading. And so what Common Core is doing is going in the wrong direction because it was written by people who had good intentions but didn't understand the dynamics of the curriculum.
Okay, thank you. One last question. I think it's my last one.
Sure.
I had the opportunity of being in D.C. about 2 weeks ago and hearing a conference that dealt largely with Common Core. And a gentleman, I don't know if you've heard of him or not, Dr. Terrence Moore from Hillsdale College up in Michigan. He spoke.
I've heard him speak, yes.
He's a history teacher, but he has been buying the Common Core textbooks for English English Lit, and looking at the way they are handling historical content in the literary textbooks. And he ended his talk with the statement that Common Core is superficial, politically biased, anti-American, anti-family, and anti-religion. Do you have any comment on that statement?
These are his observations. He is a well-learned professor. I would not comment on what he has to say because he gives examples of what he's talking about.
Yeah, he gave some awesome examples.
We have another question, Senator Sharp.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stosky, someone stands to make a lot of money off this implementation of Common Core, don't they?
You're right.
And what would be your estimated cost of this implementation of this Common Core? What is your research? Do you have any figures that you might be able to estimate as to what the overall cost?
Okay. It wasn't coming through clearly, but I think I got the gist of what you were asking for. I can't give you specific figures because the ones that I have heard, and I keep going to conferences and meetings where different figures come up, and everyone says the costs are going to be far greater than we have heard so far. It might be $50 per child, if that's the kind of figure you're talking about. Overall, at a recent conference last week, someone who's looked into the costs has said it may cost nationally $16 billion. So it depends on what you're looking at, what you're counting as part of the cost. It's going to be big money, far more. Remember, you have to have a dedicated room in a school and in every school with computers that probably are set aside for the testing purposes, and someone in charge of that room to make sure that there are no glitches that happen or to handle anything that comes up. So there are going to be personnel costs, there will be maintenance costs, there will be things that we may not even anticipate at this time. It's very difficult to know what the final bill is going to be. But as far as we know from the very beginning, technology testing companies have been very eager to promote Common Core. And I noticed that the Standards Development Committee and a good number of the people on the Validation Committee were associated with testing companies. I draw my own conclusion from who was chosen to be on the committees.
Dr. Stotsky, let me ask you this. We're running out of time, so this may be our last question. Would it make sense for someone to say that a state could implement this without it costing anything?
No State Board of Ed did a cost-benefit analysis, which was ultimately to be to their sorrow because it couldn't cost nothing. If it's going to mean anything at all, there's got to be professional development and training for teachers and new materials. Now, you might say that substitutes for what they would have bought anyway, but if this is supposed to be a radical transformation, which is what some people have claimed who support it, it has to cost something more than what you've planned for. And the question is, what are you getting for your money's worth? Do you know what you're getting for your money's worth? Has to cost something. Anyone who says that it costs nothing simply doesn't know how schools and education policy work.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stotsky. We appreciate your time. You have done a fabulous job. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today, and we appreciate it so very, very much. All right, well, seeing 3:15, I call us back into our session. We have our final presentation from Mr. Jamie Gass. Let me take just a moment to read a short bio on him. Jamie Gass is Pioneer Institute's Director of the Center for School Reform. At Pioneer, he has framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K through 12th education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. Previously, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Educational Quality and Accountability, a senior policy analyst, technical writer, and in the state budget office under 2 Massachusetts governors. In the 1990s, Jamie worked for the dean, the Boston University School of Education, Boston University Management Team, in its historic partnership with the Chelsea Public Schools. He has appeared on numerous media outlets and has been quoted in numerous publications. So, Mr. Gass, you are recognized. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members and Senator. I want to really tell you how grateful I am for the opportunity to come and provide testimony to you about the Common Core. I also want to take the opportunity to thank and show our appreciation for the Speaker of the House here in Oklahoma for his strong words and skepticism about Common Core. But mostly I want to thank Jenny and Lynn and the other Oklahoma moms who invited me down here to help provide some insights into our experiences in Massachusetts and the work that we've done on Common Core. So I work for a place called Pioneer Institute. It's a Boston-based think tank that's been around for about 20 years. We are one of the prime movers behind a lot of the successful education reforms of the last 20 years in Massachusetts. We're probably best known for the work we've done on school choice, charter schools, and the like, but we've had a keen interest in academic standards for some time. We're known for our independence and the thorough data-driven elements in our research. And in fact, many of the authors that you heard just previous were folks that we lined up and commissioned to do this work on Common Core. We're very proud of the fact that we are independent. We take no government money. We have not taken any foundation money for our work on Common Core whatsoever. So we believe that it helps provide an independent, straight talk on what Common Core is all about. So just to give you a little bit of a context, I want to just sort of define what Common Core is up front. So Common Core state standards are a product of the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. That's the commissioners of education from each state. They've gotten generous funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I think about $170 million by our calculation, not only for the development of the standards, but in most instances, the evaluation of those standards. So it can truly be said that Common Core, when it comes to the Gates Foundation, they're both, the Gates Foundation is both judge and jury in their own case in a lot of instances. And in fact, the only other cost analysis that has been done on Common Core, aside from ours, was also conducted by an institution from Washington, D.C. that also accepted Gates Foundation money. So I want to give you just a little bit of historical context before I talk about Common Core. I think the Founding Fathers were very wise. They understood that there is a proper balance between state and local considerations in our form of government. And under our national government, the federal government is responsible for defense and trade and foreign policy, but K-12 education historically has been the proper purview of state and local governments. And in fact, even at this late date, 90% of the funding for K-12 education in this country comes from state and local governments. While the U.S. Constitution is virtually silent on K-12 education, the state constitutions are quite specific. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So in my home state of Massachusetts, the Constitution was drafted by John Adams in 1779. There's several paragraphs. They're called the Cherish Clause, and it goes into a lot of detail about how state and local officials are responsible for cherishing literature, mathematics, science, and the like, and that it's their responsibility to perpetuate this for their posterity. Also, too, in Virginia, with some input from Thomas Jefferson, but primarily through James Madison and George Mason, the Virginia Constitution, too, is very specific and clear about the proper role and duties of state and local officials in perpetuating K-12 education. And we all know from our history lessons that both the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Conventions were comprised of delegates from states. States and the representation of states is an elemental part of what we call competitive federalism, which is this balance between state, local, and national authority. And I'd submit that that system has actually served this country quite well. It's taken us from essentially a collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard to now the most powerful country in the world. And it done so in a pretty short period of time. But again, as the founding fathers were very wise, they understood that keeping that education at the state and local level, and particularly closely and intimately connected with parents and teachers, the people that are the most responsible for raising children and educating children, is really the way to go. But again, that system, I think, everyone across the political spectrum will acknowledge, has begun to fray in recent decades. And in fact, in 1983, President Ronald Reagan commissioned a report called A Nation at Risk. And what it found was that the current status of public education in the United States had fallen quite dramatically from its probably high point in the 40s and 50s. Specifically, they are very concerned about the ability of the United States to compete internationally with countries like Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and China and the like. But what that report from President Reagan's commission did not do was come up with a top-down solution for Washington, D.C. In fact, there's a real skepticism in and around Nation at Risk of these education trade groups that we now find pushing Common Core. So there's been different remedies that states have pursued to try to improve public education. One of the approaches was developed by Milton Friedman, the economist, in the 1980s, called for greater school choice, parental choice through charter schools and vouchers, homeschooling, and other choice models. But there was always, in the 1980s, a group that coalesced around these education trade groups in Washington, D.C., who always believed that the way in which we could reform public education was through a top-down approach driven Washington, D.C. And I'll speak specifically about some of the interests in and around the first Bush administration and then in the early 1990s and the first Clinton administration that are the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the American Federation for Teachers, Republicans and Democrats, but largely DC-based interests that really believe that if we all just had a set of national standards, testing, and curricula, that we could solve the educational problems. There's a third model that was really pursued in my state of Massachusetts. I'm just going to tell you briefly about it because it has a great deal of bearing on how we view Common Core and how we got involved with Common Core. So in the early 1990s, Republican Governor Bill Weld, in conjunction with two Democratic state legislators, Tom Birmingham and Mark Roosevelt, sat down and crafted what they call the Grand Bargain. And what the Grand Bargain is that the state agreed to put in additional state and commit localities for a base funding in exchange for all the difficult things that people in K-12 education had not wanted to do over the previous decades, which had been a deep commitment to English, math, science, and history, a kind of back-to-basics approach. You heard a little bit from the testimony of both Zev Werman and Sandra Sotsky. Sandra Sotsky is the one who developed those standards in Massachusetts. And I'll just tell you just briefly what was in those standards. There was a deep commitment to classic literature, poetry, and drama, specifically texts like Huckleberry Finn and Edith Wharton and Charles Dickens and Sherlock Holmes. These texts matter specifically because the higher quality vocabulary found in those pieces of classic literature, poetry, and drama is higher quality than what you're going to find in what they call nonfiction or informational text. Other part of the education reform in Massachusetts was having a high-stakes graduation test so that there was it kind of addressed social promotion. Dr. Stotsky then aligned the standards for the students, the testing for the students, along with the testing for the teachers. So all of the people in the system, particularly the students and the teachers, were being tested on the same material. We also injected in there some charter schools, which gave an element of school choice. So what happened in Massachusetts really has been historic, and I'm not saying this by way of bragging about my state, but I'm just trying to contrast it with the relative stagnation that the rest of the country is experiences. That so in 2005, 2007, 2009, and 2011, Massachusetts, in every category, tested on what they call the nation's report card, the NAEP test that you referred to earlier in testimony. Massachusetts scored #1 in every grade tested and every subject tested. No state had ever done it once, and Massachusetts has done it 4 times in a row. Then addressing this issue of international competitiveness, Massachusetts tested as an individual country in 2007 and 2011 against Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and Japan. And our 8th graders in 2007 were tied for #1 in the world in science. So these successes have really been remarkable. And again, I don't brag about it. I'm just saying that the evidence from Massachusetts is that if state-level boards of education, state-level leaderships and governors over a period of time can commit to high-quality academic-based standards with high-stakes testing, some choice, and accountability throughout the entire system, the evidence is that we don't have to look to Hong Kong or Singapore or Finland or all the countries that people tend to look to for international comparisons. We have a native-grown example right here in Massachusetts. So there's some school choice features, there's some charter schools, vocational technical schools, and even the Archdiocese schools in Boston also kind of aligned with this very strong commitment to rigorous academic standards in English, math, and science and history. That's the good news. The bad news is that in 2007 and 2008, the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers began to develop Common Core. Again, these folks that had been in Washington, D.C. for decades and firmly believed that the way to solve the problems in public education was not to look at Massachusetts, but to come up with a top-down solution, develop the Common Core. And then in 2009, the Obama administration initiated through the stimulus funding the Race to the Top, which is a $4.3 billion grant program that made states compete for their own tax dollars by way of signing on to agenda items that they believed were the best interests of education reform. In that Race to the Top application process, and in most instances, state legislatures really had little or no knowledge of what was going on in the Race to the Top. They were really committed to by the governor's office and the state boards of education. But the two features that were really states had to commit to in order to compete for Race to the Top was Common Core standards, or what they call college and career readiness standards, and nationalized testing. And I'll talk a little bit why that has been such a problem. So given the success that Massachusetts had in the previous several decades in education reform, and given Pioneer's role in driving some of that, Massachusetts really had the most to lose. It was always the state that the advocates of Common Core needed to put on their mantelpiece in order to get other states to fall in line. So we conducted 4 independent crosswalks that evaluated both the English and math standards found in Common Core against high standard states like Massachusetts and Georgia and Indiana and California and Texas and others. And those pieces of research were conducted. They're very exhaustive and detailed pieces of research. Dr. Stotsky did the English language arts side. Zev Werman did the math side, and then we enlisted a third mathematician, James Milgram, who was a professor of mathematics at Stanford University. Both Dr. Stotsky and Dr. Milgram had served on the validation committee for the Common Core and had refused to sign off on it. But what they did in these independent evaluations is they looked at Massachusetts and other high standard states against Common Core. And what they found is that at every step of the way, Common Core was of significantly lower quality in terms of both English and math than high standard states. They also went on to further point out, and you heard in testimony earlier, that in fact Common Core was not benchmarked against the highest performing countries in the world in math and science. Specifically, what Common Core had done is it had ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and other high standard states like Indiana and Georgia, and dramatically cut classic literature, poetry, and drama by about 60%. So even though the evidence was clear from the Massachusetts success and elsewhere that this was the way to go, they ignored that evidence and went in a different direction. The other thing that Common Core did on the mathematics side is that they also ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and California and high-performing countries, and rather than having students prepared for mathematics, Algebra 1 by 8th grade, they pushed back preparation for Algebra 1 a grade or more. In addition to that, Common Core embraced an experimental form of geometry that has never been successful in any place that's been tried in the world. So that's on the sort of the academic quality side of Common Core. But people in and around the K-12 education world for decades have known that there are actually federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government and the U.S. Department of Education from advancing, directing, validating, or funding national standards, testing, and curricula. So we enlisted a guy named Kent Talbert and Bob Eitel. They were the general counsel and deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration, two highest ranking lawyers in the federal government. What they looked at was all of the laws in and around national standards and testing, and what they found is that there actually are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits it. It's the Elementary Secondary Education Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon Johnson. There is the General Education Provisions Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon. And then there was the U.S. Education Department enabling legislation in 1979, signed by President Carter. All of these laws, and they're laws, they're not just a list of recommendations, they're federal laws that were signed by U.S. presidents, explicitly and in unequivocal language makes it clear that this is not something the U.S. Department of Education is permitted to do. Nonetheless, the U.S. Department of Education, through both the Race to the Top and directly funding the 2 national testing consortia, the Smarter Balance Testing Consortia and the PARC Testing Consortia, which is one that Oklahoma used to participate in, this is a violation of federal law. Some of the critics of our views on these things have said that these are the opinions of people on the fringe or the extremists, but right after we released our paper on the legal dimensions of Common Core, George Will, the syndicated columnist, wrote a column for the Washington Post that had ended up getting a circulation in hundreds of other papers across the country and reached about 30 million readers, saying exactly what it is that we had cited in the research about the illegality in and around Common Core. So we did a companion piece to that builds on the loss of state and local autonomy that we just released about a month or so ago. That was written by former Texas Commissioner Robert Scott. Texas is one of the few states from the beginning that said no to Common Core, said no to Race to the Top, and said no to any national testing. That piece of research was done in conjunction with Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley. But again, one of the major problems in and around Common Core is that while the federal government and some of the player education trade groups around Washington, D.C. are the ones that are foisting this on the states, in fact, the state and local governments are going to pay for 90% of it. And so we thought that someone in and around this discussion should actually do a cost projection, because most state legislatures across the country, I'd say 90 or 95% of the state legislatures, were not really informed of Common Core. They had no hearings. There were no bills in most cases across the country. And most boards of education across the country, again, I'd say 90% or higher, conducted no cost projection or cost-benefit analysis of what it would take to adopt and align Common Core with Common Core. So we enlisted a guy named Ted Rebarber. He was a staffer at the U.S. Department of Education under the first Bush administration and the first Clinton administration. So he'd worked for both Republicans and Democrats. He was the kind of staffer that had been in the room when former President Clinton and former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole and former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich were hashing out the small percentages of federal funding that go to K-12 education. And what Mr. Rebarber and his folks at Accountability Works came up with in terms of a cost projection, and I think it's actually a mid-ranged cost projection. We were certainly not trying to run up the numbers to make a point, is that they came up with a figure of $16 billion that is what it'll cost for the states and localities to implement Common Core. In a state like Massachusetts, which is a relatively small state and has already spent $100 billion with a B, to implement the successful reforms over the last 20 years, it'll cost us about $360 million for standards that are qualitatively lower than the ones that we already had. You folks in Oklahoma are somewhat lucky because it's only going to cost you $220 million. So this sort of gets us to where we are now. The fact is that we are now working in about 20 states. There's a variety of different states that have either pulled out of the National Testing Consortium, including Oklahoma and Alabama, just yesterday, Florida, Utah. There's states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Indiana that have put a pause on Common Core. But the reality of it is that the more state legislators and parents and moms in particular, I would say that a vast majority of the audiences we've spoken to, and we've spoken to groups of 5 people and we've spoken in front of 900 people, is that 70% of the audiences are moms and grandmothers. This is very much the pushback on it is very much what I would characterize as a mom-driven movement. So with that, thank you so much for the opportunity to provide testimony. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, who's first up? Representative Kern, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gass, you mentioned, am I not on? I'm on. You mentioned Race to the Top was $4.3 million. That was from the stimulus. And was that ever vetted in Congress?
So it was $4.3 billion, and there were no bills that were submitted to Congress specifically authorizing or even really discussing in detail the Common Core or the national testing or funding of national testing at all. It was all, I think, what budgeteers described as discretionary funding under the U.S. Department of Education. So there were never any congressional hearings or any bills filed specifically on national standards or testing.
Okay. Thank you. Follow up. Has Congress since done something, coming back saying the Department of Ed should not be doing this?
Senator Cruz from Texas, Senator Rubio from Florida, Senator Grassley, a variety of different congressmen have begun over the last, I'd say, 6 to 8 months, making more and more, leveling more concerns against what's going on here. I mean, in addition to the Race to the Top, the U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, has been authorizing waivers from the No Child Left Behind law. Previous U.S. Secretaries of Education were allowed to provide waivers from No Child Left Behind. That happened when Secretary Spellings was at the U.S. Department of Education. The difference between what she did and what Secretary Duncan has done is that they added additional conditions onto those waivers that were not authorized by Congress. So the waivers, in a very real sense, or at least the conditional waivers that Secretary Duncan has been authorizing, are not authorized by Congress. So he's acting unilaterally.
Mm-hmm. May I have another one?
Sure.
I have several. FERPA, the FERPA laws.
Yeah.
We heard Dr. Stotsky say that the student data system was not originally a part of Common Core, but now it seems to be. Can you address how the proponents of Common Core are going around FERPA, what they've done to FERPA, and how this data system has now become a part of it?
So part of the Race to Top application, states had to commit to, I think they call it longitudinal data systems, or it's a collection of student data over time. And again, there are these federal laws that explicitly prohibit the federal government from doing it. So what they've been trying to do is, through Race to the Top, is incentivize states to do it. I mean, there's a pattern here. You see where there are limits on what the federal government can do. The Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers develop the standards. The federal government has paid for these private testing consortia that operate outside of the U.S. Department of Education to develop the test, but they're paid for by the U.S. Department of Education. And the same thing is with the FERPA. The feds are prohibited from doing this, so they got this, try to get the states to do it. We're in the process of conducting more research on it. The two people that I would point you to as terms of experts, and these are the folks that are working on research for us, are Jane Robbins from the American Principles Project and Joy Pullman from the Heartland Institute. For my money, those are the two best experts on what's going on in the data collection side. I would describe the data collection as running parallel to Common Core. There's nothing in the Common Core standards themselves, and there's nothing in the testing, the PARC or the SBAC testing consortia that specifically talks about data collection, but it runs parallel to it. And the U.S. Department of Education, I believe, very much envisions a world. In fact, the U.S. Secretary of Education, Duncan, has talked about a world in which you can track children from really cradle to career, is what they call it. It's, pre-K through 20 or 21 or something like that. So what they're trying to do is gather both academic data and, from my point of view, a lot of personal and sort of non-academic data to create a kind of large profile for each individual child. But again, that it's not entirely clear what that's going to look like at this point.
Before I come to Representative Nolan, let me ask a question, and it would be in two parts. One, I listened to a speech by Mr. Gates today. Now, I don't know when he gave the speech, but it was recently. And he kept talking about products, producing these products. And then he talked about customers, and I would assume customers would be either schools or students. I don't really get the connection. So my first question is, if this is supposed to be so state-driven, then why is the Gates Foundation playing such a pivotal role and appear to be driving the thing? The second question, and you may have said this, so I apologize if I missed it, why is Common Core going to cost almost 4 times as much as Race to the Top? I mean, if I get your numbers right, one was 4.3 billion, this one's 16 billion.
Right. Okay. No, that's exactly right. So I think that in the beginning of my remarks, I talked about sort of there's been some decline that's going on in public education. From my point of view, one of the biggest problems, and it's one that Massachusetts remedied in our efforts, is that a lot of people in and around public education, particularly the Governors Association, Achieve Inc., who is driving the Park Consortia, the Council of Chief State School Officers, Gates Foundation, and others, they really believe that K-12 education is not what the founders envisioned, which is a system of education in English and mathematics and science in order to educate citizenship for participation in our republic. They really believe that the sole function of public education is workforce development, which really, I have to say, is more of a European model of education. And in fact, it's not even really education, it's more training. So I think that they just firmly believe that this is the way in which we need to compete in the 21st century. I think if you look at the history of the country, you see that until recent decades, when we've been trying to move to this more skills-based workforce development model, that the American system of education has actually worked quite well, both primarily for educating citizenship for participation in our country, but those deep grounding in real knowledge makes them better voters, and in fact makes them better legislators and makes them better workers too. So it has a kind of dual effect. They're much less concerned with history and civics. They're much less concerned with academic subjects as they are for this kind of workforce development. I just say one thing about that. In Massachusetts, even our vocational technical schools, and we've got a very good vocational technical program in Massachusetts, those vocational technical schools were among the lowest performing schools in the state for a long time. They embraced these academic standards, blended them with occupational education, and they saw about a 40% improvement in their test scores, which it tells you that if you're going to be a auto mechanic or you're going to be an electrician or a carpenter, you need to actually know a lot of math, and you need to know how to analyze things, and these are just good pieces of knowledge that benefit everyone. The second part of your question is that I think, generally speaking, when the federal government gets involved with things, they don't tend to do things on the cheap side, especially when other people are going to be paying for it. And so while the advocates of Common Core are from Washington, D.C., again, we're going to be paying, people at the state and local level are going to be paying for 90% of it. So they're making prescriptions that we're going to end up having to fill at the state and local level.
Well, it sounds to me like this whole program is almost more driven to create worker bees, which seems to be far less kind of liberty-based, what we've always been, and almost more like a communist-based system where you just pick out, what students are going to be. You want workers. Right. Am I getting that correct? I mean, is that kind of? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, I would definitely say that it has a more European, I would sort of say national, workforce development model. There's no question, and I think it definitely lends itself to a kind of more managed economy. Look, I work at 3 free market think tanks. The advocates of Common Core have talked about creating a market. You don't create a market. Markets create themselves organically.
That's exactly
And so what they're really doing is creating a monopoly. Let's be honest about it. When there is one national standard and all the tests, national tests are going to be aligned with it, and all the schools, whether they're private or parochial or public schools or vocational technical schools, are all going to be meeting the same standard, school choice isn't going to mean a lot under the Common Core worldview. But again, these are not people that generally have been big advocates of school choice anyway.
Yeah, okay. Representative Nolan and then Representative Kern will come back because I know you have some other follow-ups, but Representative Nolan.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Here in Oklahoma, we've had a bit of a disconnect between Common Ed and higher ed in the sense that Common Ed has been very focused on preparing for Common Core, getting our EOI tests, our end-of-the-year instruction tests, and exit exams in line. And higher ed is looking at ACT scores. They're not looking at EOIs at all. And so I'm just curious, as you know, you mentioned that Massachusetts and some of the other states that have really had a lot of success. Do they align higher ed and common ed? I love the idea about the professors that are in higher ed actually developing some of the curriculum for the STEM subjects in particular, but just period. I love that idea because it seems like it aligns it, but is that what they're doing in other states, or are we?
Yeah, so just to be clear, Massachusetts discarded our higher quality standards. We got $250 million from Race to the Top, and in fact, the only thing that changed from round one of Race to the Top, where we were 13th out of 16 states that applied, and we were number one in the second round. The only thing that changed was our agreement to adopt Common Core. So as I said earlier, it was always a case for Massachusetts was either going to not adopt or not get the money. And it just, again, it highlights the sort of the federal dimension of it. Our higher education system has gotten, I would say, a lot less focus of the efforts thus far. But I think there's no question that the current administration in Massachusetts, as well as the U.S. Department of Education, they envision a kind of seamless cradle-to-career model where, whether it's through the academic expectations in Common Core you find in K-12, I think ultimately will have a big impact on higher ed. I mean, for example, if they cut classic literature and poetry and drama by 60%, I think, you know, common sense tells you there's not going to be as many English majors going, and that will have a big impact. And people like Zev Werman and Professor Milgram have gone into even greater detail. In fact, we have a report we're going to release just next week, and you folks have an advanced copy of it, of how this is going to dramatically impact higher education, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country. The other ways in which it's going to impact higher education is that the architect of Common Core is a guy named David Coleman. He is now just in the last 6 or 8 months been appointed the head of the College Board, and he has talked about changing the vision of the SAT, for example, to align with Common Core, which in our view will significantly dumb down the SAT and change that from what they call an aptitude test. It's a projection of how kids are likely to do in higher ed to an achievement test, which is what the ACT is. So it's a hard question. It's an important and very good question, but it's a little bit of a black box because most of what they're trying to do with Common Core is implemented now at the state level. They're having a lot of resistance across the country on that alone, but I think given their inclinations on this, that it's really only a matter of time until they try to push something similar to it on higher ed. And that's why I think that, you know, the advice you got from Dr. Stotsky was a good one, was to try to develop a local matriculation test so that you're determining what it is college readiness in your state. And I could see states like Oklahoma and Texas having the independence to go that path. I'm not sure that's what will happen in Massachusetts, unfortunately. And in terms of the standards themselves, that's really how Sandy developed the high-quality standards of Massachusetts. She enlisted all of the advice from academic experts in English and math and science from our own institutions, but also across the country.
We'll go to Senator. Do you have follow-up? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, have you experienced, or have you experienced or seen any of our, in other states, any of the higher ed institutions beginning to accept the exit exams from the high school as entrance exams into higher ed?
Well, what we did in Massachusetts under the previous high stakes testing is that the state scholarship, so basically the better kids did on our MCAS test, our state test, which was a high stakes graduation test, that then made them eligible for higher education scholarships in higher education. But I have to say that I think most people in higher education across the country don't have a clue what's going on with Common Core. The world of K-12 education is pretty siloed from higher ed, and I think most of them don't have the slightest idea what's going on, and I think that it'll be, the train will be, leaving the station before they understand.
Senator Sharp, and then we'll come back to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gass, first of all, appreciate that you take the time to come here to Oklahoma and discuss this issue with us. And 2 years ago, I was in the classroom. I spent 38 years as a public school teacher, and of course, when we got these Common Core standards, obviously, I found very tremendous problems with them. And one of as an old common education teacher, one of the major things that I found it looked like the problem is with Common Core that you're trying to create a student that has all the answers but none of the facts.
Right.
And that is, to me, the major problem with Common Core.
That's good.
Yeah.
And I think that as long as we go in this direction, we're going to have problems. And there are absolutes. I don't care what teacher out there, you have to teach in absolutes. 2 + 2 = 4. And unfortunately, with Common Core, 2 + 2 may = 5 if you get the process right.
Yep.
And history, trying to discuss whether or not how George Washington would have handled the Civil War differently than what Abraham Lincoln will take kids' imagination for a few minutes, and then they'll say this is ridiculous. Because, again, you do have to have absolute somewhere. How would you like to respond to that?
I think that's well said, Senator. I think that from my perspective as having done a lot of and commissioned a lot of the research, I think in and around Common Core, there were hard-won fights in both English and math that occurred in Massachusetts and California and other places in the 90s. They called them the math wars over these fuzzy math or were more kind of fact-driven approach. Common Core was, and Jim Milgram, the Stanford mathematician, was very clear about this because it's a political document that was developed really through, well, we're not exactly sure what the process was, but they were making compromises and actually gave back things that were hard won in other states 10 or 15 years earlier. And so I think you're absolutely spot on. There's no question with Common Core. While they have some window dressing of academic content that I think all of us would agree is good quality, I think it's mostly what they're trying to do, again, is to the chairman's point, is a kind of workforce development model where you're really kind of getting inculcated in this Common Core method. And you're right. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about kids getting the right answer, but that being the wrong answer because they didn't they didn't describe how they got their answer and things like that. I mean, that's sort of textbook fuzzy math. I mean, I'll just speak from experience. I've got a 2-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old daughter in Massachusetts, and my 6-year-old was in kindergarten last year, and rather than beginning to work on the, basic, numbers and addition and subtraction and things like that, they had her baking gingerbread men and counting, gumdrop buttons and things like that doing what they call hands-on learning or experiential learning was a substitute for actually learning math facts, which I think is pretty wrong-headed.
Representative Kern, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I heard it said like this last couple of weeks in this meeting that I attended was they're not asking the students to read the Constitution at all, but yet one of the exercises is to debate the Constitution, and someone said they're asking students to have opinions on things of which they know nothing about. Yeah. And that's a lot of Common Core. A question is, in Massachusetts, they did so well with the standards that they have. Were homeschoolers included in that or not? Do you know?
So it's an excellent question. The way homeschoolers are authorized in Massachusetts is that the parents or need to go before the local school board not the State Board of Education, but the local school committee, and get authorization. I think that, again, the performance in Massachusetts was so good, and that even the archdiocese schools, and I talked about as well as Massachusetts did, the archdiocese schools, the Catholic schools in Massachusetts adopted the Massachusetts standards, because they thought it was better aligned with a Catholic education or Christian education than what they were doing before. I mean, it's that kind of deep commitment to humanities and poetry and literature and drama that kind of help us and our children understand what it means to be human. But I think that some of the homeschool folks at least copied some of it. They probably exceeded it, to be honest with you. That one of the issues that we have is that homeschoolers then will, under Common Core, will have to go to their local school committee and get authorization. And again, if the SAT and the ACT and these other college, entrance exams are tied to Common Core, it's going to, I think, create a lot of problems for homeschoolers.
Okay. Another question I have, it's already been mentioned that it looks like Common Core is focusing more upon skills rather than academic knowledge.
Yep.
So has your institute done anything to look at the involvement of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Common
I
Core?
mean, that has been, one of the troubling dimensions of this, and we've not done a lot of research on it, but we've informally, developed spreadsheets that total it up. I mean, the Gates Foundation has spent about $170 million, and they've given grants to state boards of education and the associations around state boards of education, the PTA, the PTA, obviously the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers. They've funded Education Week, which is a newspaper, a trade newspaper that, and they've basically funded them to cover it. ExxonMobil has run ads that I think many of us have seen. They've funded the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, there's no question there's an enormous amount of money behind Common Core. But again, I think that some of the big business interests around it, there's no question, I think, are doing it, again, for this sort of workforce development view. I mean, the thing that I'm a little curious about is that there's no question the conflicts of interest around Common Core have conflicts of interest. I mean, you have organizations that may or may not benefit from technology deals that are advocating for these things. And I think the other thing that's, noteworthy about, say, IBM or some of the other, larger corporations is that, they generally speaking don't hire a lot of high school graduates. They actually hire more college graduates, particularly in these, science and technology fields. So I think there is a kind of an agenda there. So.
Okay, I have one more really good question, but just the article by Robert Scott, can we get that on your website?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's called The Republic of Republics.
Okay, that's not
by
my
Robert
question.
Scott and Chuck Grassley, the senator from.
The Republic of Republics?
A Republic of Republics.
Okay.
I can't remember the exact title, but how Common Core damages
Jan
state
Robbins
local.
is with?
Jane Robbins is
Jane.
with the American Principles Project.
Okay.
And if you do a Google search, her name will pop up right away, and there's an excellent YouTube video where she talks about the data collection.
And Joy Pullman is with Pioneer?
No, she's with the Heartland Institute.
Heartland,
Yeah.
okay.
So those are two authors that we've commissioned to look into the data issue in more detail.
All right, now, a question that I have for you is, we're told all the time, these are just standards.
Yep.
You can do anything you want within the standards. But standards determine what's on the test.
Right.
Which is going to, would you not agree with this question? That standards determine what's going to be on the assessments, which then will determine what is taught, which then determines your curriculum. So,
Right.
Do you think the standards and not curriculum, what is your thoughts on that?
So this is what we know. We know that the federal government has incentivized states to adopt Common Core through Race to the Top, and we know that the federal government has directly funded the two national testing consortia. They claim that they're not in curriculum, but the title of the legal paper, again, written by these two lead lawyers from the second Bush administration, is called A Road to a National Curriculum. The standards are kind of a scaffolding, and then the local curriculum fits in at the state and local level with that. And But if you determine the standards and you've basically boxed in so that the curriculum will have to be a Common Core curriculum. And in point of fact, the application for the two national testing consortia, PARC and the Smarter Balance, the U.S. Department of Education specifically mentions that they are also supposed to develop curricular and instructional materials to go along with the testing. Mm-hmm. So this idea that it isn't a curriculum or it won't be a curriculum, it's a real fig leaf. I think only common sense tells you that that's where that's heading.
Last question, it's real short. He can answer this
Okay.
in one sentence. Okay, Utah is one of the states that's gotten out of PARC, and they've gotten into something else, AIM or something. Do you know about that?
AIR, yeah. So
What is it?
So you folks got out of PARC. Utah got out of Smarter Balance.
Smarter Balance, okay.
Georgia got out of PARC, and just yesterday, the governor of Florida pulled them out of PARC. So there is a minimum. When the U.S. Department of Education funded the two national testing consortia, there's a minimum, I think, of 15 states, and PARC is, I think, at 16, or it's close now. But the U.S. Department of Education has said they're going to brush that aside. So I think at this point, the testing consortia will go forward. But the testing side is still kind of an open question because, look, the states adopted both the standards and committed to the tests before they were done. And the tests, I mean, we know from research that we've done and conversations we've had that they've used a cost of like $29 for PARC. There's a 40-year testing expert who I met with from California who told me that's a budget appropriation figure. It's actually going to be like $39 per student for both of the testing consortia. But they're also running about a year behind. So by Oklahoma pulling out of PARC, you've not only given yourself a little bit of breathing room to pursue some other options, but what I would do is I would try to, you could work with Texas. I mean, we all should sort of say a prayer for Texas every night because from the beginning they said they weren't doing this, and it's a huge textbook state and it's a huge driver of things in K-12 education. And so there will be materials, there will be tests, there will be textbooks that will be non-Common Core, and it's because of Texas. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gass. We appreciate it so much. We want to thank all three of our presenters. I want to thank all of the legislators who are here and all of you who are here. Thank you so much for being here. We are adjourned.